I'd like to start, please, just with some of the forensic building blocks underpinning your evidence today and the issue of the provision of material to the inquiry. In your statement, you set out how you rarely use text to communicate with colleagues. Your phone, you said, doesn't retain, and nor do you have access to text messages at all relating to the period of the crisis. And in addition, you said, although on occasion you use WhatsApp to communicate around meetings and logistics and so on, you generally were only party to WhatsApp groups that were set up to deal with individual circumstances, such as arrangements for calls, meetings, and so on and so forth. Is that broadly correct?
Yes, that is all broadly correct.
You don't now have access to any of the WhatsApps that you did send during the time of the crisis, do you?
No, I don't. I've changed my phone multiple times over the past few years, and as that has happened, the messages have not come across. As you said, I'm not a prolific user of WhatsApp in the first instance, primarily communication with my private office, and obviously anything that was of significance through those conversations or exchanges will have been recorded officially by my civil servants, as one would expect.
Evidence has been given to the inquiry to the effect that Mr. Johnson announced the institution of this inquiry in May 2021. And around that time, officials discussed the need for ministers and others to retain WhatsApps. It was a matter of debate, in fact, in WhatsApp communications between officials themselves. Around that time, April and May 2021, did nobody say to you, Chancellor, it's important that you do retain your WhatsApps, or we need to put into place measures for them to be backed up in case they become relevant to an inquiry?
No, I don't recall either of those conversations that you referred to between officials, but you might have been referring to officials in number 10 rather than the Treasury. And yes, and I don't recall anyone in my office making that recommendation or observation to me at the time.
Do you happen to recall, it's probably quite a long shot, but do you recall changing phones around that time as it happened?
Not around that time, as I said. I have changed my phone multiple times in the years since then, and as I said previously, every time that's happened, the messages wouldn't have come across. But as I said, I'm not a prolific user of WhatsApp, and with the private office, again, that would have all been recorded formally on the record, or indeed where I've had exchanges with other individuals. Some of those have been part of the evidence that's formed the inquiry's deliberations.
Mr. Hancock said in evidence, when he gave evidence on the 30th of November, that it was at that cabinet meeting on the 8th of July that he heard about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme for the first time. The scheme was announced, you'll recall, on the same day, the 8th of July, as part of the plan for jobs. Given that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme encouraged the coming together of different households in indoor spaces, which it did, of course, in restaurants, why was that plan not put by the Treasury in front of SAGE, in front of the Secretary of State for Health, and or the Chief Medical Officer for their consideration of the very same issue of the absolute risk of transmission?
So the first thing to say is why do Eat Out to Help Out at all?
No, please. There is a method to my madness. I'm asking you why, in light of the obvious issue of risk of transmission inherent in any scheme that encouraged households to come together, did the Treasury not consult with SAGE, the CMO, the Secretary of State for Health, or anybody else outside number 10?
Because Eat Out to Help Out had been designed specifically in the context of the safe lifting of MPIs that had already been signed off, as we talked about before, as part of the May plan, which had reopened hospitality, indoor hospitality. That had already been part of the approved May plan. Eat Out to Help Out only operated within that context. And indeed, there were a significant range of other MPIs that were in place, including social distancing, COVID secure guidance, table service, contactless ordering, one-way systems, all of which had been put in place. But the overall reopening of indoor hospitality had already been implemented and, as we discussed before, modelled and all the rest of it and involved scientists in that. And Eat Out to Help Out was designed to operate within that context of the safe lifting of MPIs. It didn't do anything further than that. This was a micro policy to make sure that that capacity, which the scientists had already said was part of an overall package which could be safely delivered, was actually used. And it was done very much in that context. And in the same way that other economic decisions like a VAT cut for hospitality or a stamp duty cut or indeed furlough or anything else or grants for the hospitality industry wouldn't ordinarily be cleared with medical advisors, nor was this, because we had already made the collective decision to reopen indoor hospitality, and this was a policy that sat within and beneath that. Of course, I had conversations with the Prime Minister. As I said, you share a garden, your neighbours, you live together. Of course, there'd be conversations I'll be having with him. And in terms of written records, I mean, I'm sure we'll get onto it. At multiple moments, I would write to him with just so that he could have it in one place, a set of thoughts or analysis from me with regard perhaps to exit roadmaps or the 2 metre to 1 metre, or there'll be others, or travel. So there's there is actually, in fact, lots of different bits of evidence that you have and that we've provided of when I did actually write to him formally at particular points where I thought it made sense to lay out a set of arguments from me to him.
And we will look at some of the bilateral. There are many, many bilateral meetings where formally your officials and yourself and the Prime Minister and his officials met to talk about COVID-related issues as well as all the other economically related issues you raise. It's just that what is the inquiry to make of the suggestion here, to which you do appear to lend your support, that there was a form of communication between the Prime Minister that was not recorded and was obviously of significance?
Well, I think the point I'd probably challenge is of significance. I think it is genuinely impossible for every single conversation between two cabinet ministers, whoever they are, to be recorded. I mean, there aren't civil servants following cabinet ministers through the division lobbies on a typical evening where they might be chatting about something, or if I was having lunch with my family in the garden at the same time that the Prime Minister was on a typical weekend in Downing Street, and we'd obviously be chatting as we were barbecuing or something. I mean, it's clearly impractical to think that every single conversation between two cabinet ministers can be recorded in that way, but I think everyone would accept that. But I think that's obviously fine, because what is happening is when there are formal decisions to be made and formal conversations to be had, those are happening with officials, they are minuted, they're happening in cabinet committees or COVID-Os or COVID-Ss or in cabinet itself or in bilateral meetings, and the decision itself is made in those forums, and that's ultimately what matters, is the decision and how it was made and who fed into it, and that's all a matter of public record and recorded correctly.
We need to be quite clear, don't we, that the reality was that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, yourself and HMT, took every opportunity to bring to the attention of the Prime Minister the potential consequences of the lockdown decisions and the fiscal and economic harm that would be done. That's very apparent. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that was my primary responsibility, and that's what we did.
And if we look at 182359, this is an analytical note which expressly refers to it being a trade-off between continuing COVID-19 social distancing and minimising foregone economic activity and other costs. Was this a document produced by HMT, dated the 22nd of April, provided to the Quad group of ministers, that's to say, the group of yourself, the first Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Rabb, Mr. Gove and Mr. Hancock? whilst the Prime Minister was ill. So a Treasury document that expressly addresses the trade-off between continuing social distancing and economic activity.
I'm not familiar with that document, so I don't know if it's clear who
You may
it's
not
come
know
from.
the individual document, but
Well, I do recall, because the person who wrote it, I worked with him in a previous guise, and I don't think he did work at Treasury. I thought he was in a different department, so it's not obvious to me that the document does come from the Treasury or not. So I can't say that it does come from the Treasury. My point, though, referring to the quote you had from the Spectator article previously, was not about the substance of the discussions that were happening in government, which, as you rightly said, and I was making the point about some of the consequences. Again, not just economic, but the other impacts in all other walks of life as well. The point was about the communication strategy. And I can certainly sympathise, actually, with a communication strategy that wanted to simplify things, because we were dealing with something that was, again, unprecedented. We didn't know how people would respond, behave, comply. And so the sense was a simpler communication strategy would be better for achieving that objective, and it was just better to focus on the health impacts, and because that would be the way to improve compliance. And I have sympathy. That's a reasonable argument to make, but that argument that was made to achieve that aim came at the cost of not having from the beginning a broader conversation about the other impacts and other walks of life. And again, impacts that may not be felt immediately, but would be felt down the line.
why did the Treasury not raise expressly the scheme for Eat Out to Help Out in the COVID-S meeting of the 16th of July, the COVID-S meeting of the 22nd of July, the COVID-S meeting of the 6th of August, all of which were concerned with transmission risk, August planning, self-isolation periods, schools, scenarios, September return dates, but nothing about Eat Out to Help Out. Why was that?
But I think that exactly illustrates my point, because I think what people have missed in this conversation is that there was almost a month between the announcement of Eat Out to Help Out and its commencement. A month. A month for people to raise concerns that they may have had. And actually, it's precisely in those three meetings that you mentioned. COVID-S on the 16th of July, the Chief Medical Officer in the minutes talked about two significant risk moments, schools and winter. He did not mention Eat Out to Help Out. On the 22nd of July, if I could just finish because it's important, on the 22nd of July, the agenda item is August planning. And again, it was not raised by the Chief Scientific Advisor or Chief Medical Officer. On the 6th of August, the COVID-S meeting that you acknowledged, again, the minutes show that returning to schools was the single riskiest element of the government's plan. Those three meetings all happened after the announcement of Eat Out to Help Out. All of them involved the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer. They considered specifically the forthcoming risks, and in none of those meetings was it raised by them as an issue. Indeed, the PPS to the Prime Minister has also been specific in his evidence to this inquiry that he doesn't recall representations being made to them to revisit the policy. So I know there's been a lot of commentary on this point, but there was almost a month between announcement and commencement. I've outlined my reasons for why we implemented the policy and why we thought it was the right thing to do, and I believe it was the right thing to do to safeguard those jobs in the context of the safe reopening that had already been agreed. But at none of those moments, in those meetings, there was plenty of opportunity for people to have raised it either with me or with the Prime Minister. I don't recall, and the minutes do not suggest, that it was raised at all in the three precise meetings that you mentioned.
Those meetings, Mr. Sunak, were raised by you in your own witness statement as examples of meetings in which no concerns were raised. But do you accept that the issue of Eat Out to Help Out was never raised by you or your department expressly at those meetings or at any other earlier meeting, and that by the date of those meetings, the scheme had already been announced following the Cabinet on the 8th of July and announced to the public the same day? It was already in place.
But why would I raise it as a risk when I didn't believe that it was? Because it was designed in the context of a safe reopening. The onus is surely on the people who now believed that it was a risk to have raised it at the time when something could have been done about it if they felt strongly. I'm very clear that I don't believe that it was, because hospitality had been deemed to be safe to reopen with a considerable, as I said, hundreds of pages of guidance, changes in practice, and had been recommended by think tanks and had been done by countries elsewhere. This was a very reasonable, sensible policy intervention to help safeguard those jobs in that safe reopening. That was my view. I didn't believe that it was a risk. I believed it was the right thing to do. But if others are suggesting that they didn't, they had ample opportunity to raise those concerns in forums where I was or where the Prime Minister or others were, and they didn't.
Why didn't you tell the Secretary of State for Health in a public health crisis before the 8th of July that you were planning on announcing, once it had gone through Cabinet that day, a scheme to eat out and help out? Why didn't you, bearing in mind that this was a scheme to encourage households to come together, and you'd been debating at the very same time the reduction in the 2 metre to 1 metre rule, say to the CMO, we have this plan. It's to encourage the economy to open up, to help the hospitality sector. There are very strong public policy reasons in support of it, but it's obvious there are transmission risks. Of course there were, but our position is it's all right. We are just simply going to have to do this in the greater good. But you never raised it at all with anybody outside Number 10.
Because, as would be completely normal for all economic policy before fiscal events, that's long-standing practice. It always has been so. I wouldn't have discussed the VAT cut on the hospitality sector with the Secretary of State for Health, or the stamp duty cut, or the grants. These are all either market-sensitive or economic issues.
Mr. Sunak, forgive me, those are all fiscal measures. The Eat Out to Help Out scheme encouraged more people, additional numbers from different households, to come together in restaurants to eat. It wasn't just a fiscal issue, it was a behavioural matter. Was it one that was applied across the whole of the United Kingdom?
Yes, but so were many of the economic interventions. But again, the point remains, indoor hospitality, all the points you made about people coming together and eating was already part of the May plan, had already been collectively agreed and announced. It had been said to the country, restaurants were safe to visit with all the extra COVID secure systems that had been put in place. That was the message, so much so that the Cabinet Office ran a national campaign entitled Enjoy Summer Safely, backed it with considerable funding and national advertising, partnered with brand name companies, because the overall approach was to tell the country it was now safe to return to doing these activities because we had made progress on the virus, because we had track and trace, because we had the JBC, because we had all this COVID secure guidance. That was the very clear message backed by a national advertising campaign. It just wouldn't be entirely normal to discuss individual fiscal measures with people that sat within that context. I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that, of course, there are lots of other impacts that come from decisions. My particular responsibility was to make sure that the economic ones were considered, or the Prime Minister had an opportunity to consider them.
It is obvious that you've spoken.
There's a separate question. Sorry to interrupt. And then there's a separate question about how much it is appropriate to talk about those in public, which is what this refers to.
We need to be clear about this, Mr. Sunak. You made no bones about the fact that there was a trade-off, that there were huge, it's self-evident, devastating economic and societal consequences from the lockdown decisions. That is obvious. The whole country knows that. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, yourself, made no bones about it. The Treasury raised quite properly, perhaps constitutionally, all the concerns that needed to be raised. But you reject the suggestion, which appears to be given by this article, that full debate, the nature of the trade-off, wasn't properly identified, or at least wasn't properly ventilated by you, perhaps because of briefings by Number 10. And I want to ask you whether that was in fact correct.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Did ministers brief you, or rather did Number 10 brief you, that you couldn't raise the obvious issue of the economic and fiscal harm that would be done by a lockdown decision? Was that not, in fact, a debate that was obvious to everybody, and it was a debate in which you played a full part?
As I said, that debate was certainly something that happened in the deliberations. As we've previously been discussing, it didn't happen particularly extensively for the first lockdown because everything happened very quickly at that point and was driven, as I said, largely by the public health advice. Over time, that debate became, I'd say, more a feature of the discussions, particularly because we started to have more understanding and evidence of the impact on the short term, at least, of what lockdowns were doing or the MPIs were doing in other domains or other walks of life. So that was the kind of evolution of the debate inside of government. As I said, from a comms strategy, very understandably, as I said, reasonable people can disagree. Simplicity of message is often important, and the simpler message was just to focus on the public health side of it earlier on. And again, I think that evolved over time.
The subject, Prime Minister, is read out Friday bilat. Is bilat a shorthand for the meetings that you had bilaterally with the Prime Minister?
Yes.
On NPI, non-pharmaceutical easements, non-pharmaceutical intervention easements, no actions for teams, just for info only. Your Principal Private Secretary says, following the inconclusive strategy meeting, the Prime Minister, Chancellor met and discussed the plan for NPI easements on Friday. No other minister included, shows the strength of the Chancellor's voice in these discussions. This email, did you see this email after the event? Did you see the readout? Do you recall?
No, I wouldn't typically see these,
All right.
these readouts.
She does appear there to be referring to how, as the Chancellor, because of your ability to meet bilaterally with the Prime Minister, your voice carried a particular strength. Would you agree?
I'm not entirely sure. I would agree in any disproportionate sense. It's completely normal for the Prime Minister to meet with the Chancellor bilaterally. I do the same now in this job. Previous Prime Minister did the same. I mean, that's unsurprising.
So that we're not at cross purposes. There is no suggestion, any impropriety, meeting with the Prime Minister bilaterally. You are the Chancellor. He is the Prime Minister. It's a vital relationship to the workings of government. But I want to ask you to assess the strength of your voice in those discussions on the issues which directly concerned the pandemic because of the debate about SAGE and the MPI easements and the plans and so on.
As I've already said, I felt I always had the opportunity to convey my thoughts and provide advice to the Prime Minister. I said that early on. And that happened in a range of forums, whether in these bilateral meetings or through the smaller group meetings or the COVID-O or the COVID-S. I've been, I think, consistent in my evidence that I always felt I had the opportunity to provide the Prime Minister with advice.
Indeed.
I wouldn't read anything particularly into the fact that I had a bilateral meeting with him. I'm sure he was having bilateral meetings with other ministers as well, all part of how he would like to make decisions, and that ultimately is a question for him.
236594, page 1, is another email from Elizabeth Perelman to various recipients in the Treasury. We can see at the bottom of that first page, the Chancellor in particular wanted to thank you, the economic team, the health team and the COVID team for all the work. The briefs and information meant the Chancellor was well armed to challenge and scrutinise the proposal. I should say this is dated the 9th of October, Prime Minister, and had a level of detail beyond the rest of the room which allowed us to make and land our points with a great result. An outline of the wider discussion is below, but afterwards there was a smaller Prime Minister-Chancellor huddle, and the upshot is no final decision has been taken on the MPIs. And then over the page, please. However, the Prime Ministerial steer is that he's not minded to agree to the Cabinet Office proposal. His preference is either to do nothing or close pubs only. And then, under the bulleted points, clearly there is a high risk that this is unpicked over Friday the weekend. So 2 questions, please, Mr. Sunak. Firstly, the reference to the fact that there was a huddle between yourself and the Prime Minister after the general debate appears to suggest that with this Prime Minister there was an ability to get the last word in, to meet with him and to be able to influence his ultimate decision. And secondly, the reference to unwinding and unpicking a position which appears to have been agreed suggests that this wasn't an open-ended debate which led to a consistent decision. There was the ability to be able to unwind or unpick a position which had already been reached. Do you agree with both those propositions or neither?
Well, obviously I didn't write the email,
No.
so I don't know precisely what it refers to. And is it possible that I might have had a chat with the Prime Minister once a meeting wound up on my way back somewhere? Of course that's possible. He might have said to me, that was interesting, I'm thinking X as a result of it. I mean, I don't think anything particularly wrong with that, right? I mean, I don't call it huddle or not. It might be just that he might have just giving me a sense of where his head was at that particular moment in time. And again, I don't think there's anything particularly untoward about that, to be honest. And as I've talked previously about decision-making processes, and ultimately there would be a final decision taken at an appropriate forum. It might well be that there had been an iterative process leading up to that. But again, I don't think in and of itself that is necessarily a bad thing. And again, I'm not entirely sure what this specifically refers to.
You referred to the fact that there might be an issue as to where his head is at, where the Prime Minister has reached in terms of his thinking. And I need to ask you, because of the evidence which has been given by his former cabinet secretaries, his former chief advisor, his former director of communications, also by privately his chief scientific advisor, that he had a tendency to back and veer, to bear the impression of the last person who sat in him in terms of the debates which were raging in Downing Street, and that this led to a degree of chaos, or to use Sir Patrick Vance's words, operational inefficiency. Were you aware that his closest advisors had seemingly unanimously taken the view that there was a lack of efficiency? The administration is described privately as brutal and useless, or criminally incompetent, or operationally chaotic. Was any of that known to you?
No, I don't think any of those comments were shared with me at the time. You made a point, though, Mr. Keith, is that debates raged. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing.
No, indeed.
I mean, these. It's right that there was vigorous debate because these were incredibly consequential decisions.
If we could just look at 236583, it's an email from, again, your principal private secretary in the Treasury to various recipients. And as you rightly say, this is in fact dated April, but it's on the cusp of the debate about the recovery plan. So, as you say, the debate about coming out of the lockdown. The email, it says, the Chancellor is considering the paper for the Cabinet Office process. Quick readout of the discussion in the meeting this afternoon, and then obviously references to your position in relation to the various issues which are being debated within the Treasury. How difficult it is to argue that the MPI should be lifted while the number of cases and deaths is still rising, but that you are broadly supportive of the strategy that encourages return behaviour back to the economy. Then there's a reference to economic groups starting to model, and your wish that you have very clearly in mind the exact timetable of what advice on modelling has been given, and then a reference to the timing of any decision. If you could go forward, please, to page 4, we will see this specifically following up on NPI Commission, Non-Pharmaceutical Intervention Commission. I know you're already working on a paper updating the Chancellor on the economic impact of NPIs. There's going to be a wider cabinet discussion. And then this at 3B, Prime Minister. I propose the following as a next step: a paper that we can share with the Prime Minister ahead of the bilateral, an opportunity for the Chancellor to set out his views and the economic analysis of the Prime Minister without it being watered down by the Cabinet Office process. Do you know what that is a reference to, the watered down by the Cabinet Office process? Because plainly, you as the Chancellor are absolutely entitled, you suggested it yourself, perhaps constitutionally obligated to bring the economic angle to bear in front of the Prime Minister without it being watered down by any other part of government. So what is that a reference to, do you think?
Obviously, I didn't write the email, so it's hard for me to comment. And if you flick back to the earlier bit of the email, I think, actually, as you can see from that, it clearly mentions a Cabinet Office process.
Yes.
Which is right and appropriate, but also, even when it talks about modelling on sectors, to bring that together with CMO thinking on the health impacts.
But
I think
very...
even in that email, you can see, as I said, I didn't write it, so I'm not sure entirely what it's referring to, but it's clear that there is a Cabinet Office process that we are feeding into, CMOs feeding in, and that's the right way for the Prime Minister to receive.
There is no suggestion but that there shouldn't be a process. There has to be a process. The Cabinet Office will synthesise to some extent what is contributed by other government departments. But these are the most senior officials in your department talking about your position and your thoughts and what should be done in advance of a bilateral. And it refers to a concern that your voice might be watered down by the Cabinet Office. And therefore, that must have been something of which you were aware, if only in the most general terms.
I think, as I said previously, I never felt that I didn't have an opportunity to feed in what I wanted to the Prime Minister. And again, I didn't write the email. I'm not sure how officials may have felt in their conversations with other departments or the Cabinet Office. I generally thought we had good, constructive relations. And for my part, I felt I always had the opportunity to feed into the Prime Minister's thinking.
Right. A second noteworthy debate was taking place before we look at the detail of the roadmap. You expressed concern in May, in fact, at a 9:15 meeting on the 14th of May, that international polling had suggested that the British people were more fearful of the virus than other countries. And in the Spectator article, to which I've already referred you, you state that when you say this, it's quoted, "In every brief, we tried to say, let's stop the fear narrative. It was always wrong from the beginning. I constantly said it was wrong." What was that about? What was your concern about the general response of the British people?
Again, from an economic perspective, we are a consumption-driven economy, and therefore people's jobs and livelihoods and our ability to pay for public service is a function of consumption being strong. And if you have a situation like this where we've actively discouraged or shut down consumption sectors from operating, once they reopen, it was a point of concern for me and for anyone thinking about the economy and those jobs as to the pace of return, of people returning to normal activity over time. Because if they didn't, then that would have significant implications for many people's jobs.
Mr. Sunak, your concern that unless the economy was reopened at perhaps a somewhat faster speed than some other cabinet ministers were advising, we would be at risk of placing the United Kingdom at a competitive disadvantage. And you referred to international comparative data, in essence, how other European countries were showing, you said, how reopening the economy can be done. Can we just look very briefly at the issue of comparative data? Did the Treasury, throughout the whole crisis, refer repeatedly, of course, to what other countries were doing, what their data was demonstrating, what ultimate decisions they were taking in light of their own particular positions? And was that something that was at the forefront of the debate when these arguments came to be ventilated in front of the Prime Minister?
I think it's probably too much to say it was at the forefront, but certainly right to say it was another piece of information that was helpful and worth taking into account.
This is a note from your Principal Private Secretary referring to a bilateral on Tuesday. The subject matter is PM bilateral on Tuesday. On the first page, there is a reference to the Prime Minister's instinct, we can see there in the first bullet point, being that we might have overdone lockdown, telling that no other countries closed construction, turned to our international slide, but said interesting that there are new opportunities coming out of this and online is growing. And he also says a little later down the page, a little further down the page, that the sooner gets this open, the better, but then refers to the risk of another exponential increase. And I think he says, overall, he's agitated that he didn't have a plan. Yes. To what extent in these early days of the roadmap, Mrs. Sunak, was the Prime Minister concerned as to how he would equate the imperative of making sure that there be no unnecessary risk in growth in prevalence and the need to get the economy back going? It must have been a source of perpetual anxiety, and you had these debates with him as to how he should resolve them.
Again, probably better addressed to him, but we recapped previously the economic impacts. By this point, we had a much greater sense of what they were because we were, I don't see the date of this email, but I think did you say May or end of April?
Yes, it's the end of April, 28th of April.
The government's independent forecaster, the OBR, had published their reference scenario, I think perhaps a week, 10 days before this, so that would be in the public domain. It was pretty stark. I won't recap it all again, but that was then out there, and we were collecting real-time data on the number of people who were furloughed, the businesses that were shut, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be unsurprising if that wasn't something that he was considering.
Should we have a look at 232181? It's a readout of SAGE from your Principal Private Secretary. Vallance noted the heavy trailing in the press of the measures the government has now announced it will relax. He and Whitty had made clear to the policymakers that this package was at the riskier end of the spectrum, with the potential to increase R above 1, and that they needed to be prepared to reimpose measures if necessary. Noted also this package reduces the space for doing other things like bringing schools back in September. If schools are to return, policymakers may have to reimpose restrictions in other places like retail. The government had obviously made the various decisions that it made in relation to the 3 steps in the roadmap. But by the end of June, the Treasury was, of course, considering the voucher scheme that became Eat Out to Help Out. Was that not something that was being contemplated at the end of June with a view to its implementation in August?
Yes, I mean, I don't recall seeing that email, so that didn't come to me. As I said, the exit plan was developed and hadn't changed, and I strongly recall it being modelled in terms of the impact on R, and people broadly being comfortable that it did just about keep things at that level. And I think the other thing, as I said, that was relevant consideration at this time was that in June, probably actually 3 days before this email, the SAGE minutes record that there had been errors that meant that for some time they had been overestimating the rate of transmission, making it look artificially high.
Well, so there was an issue about hospital data, was there not?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the SAGE minutes from the 20th of June, it's very clear that SAGE, because there were errors in the data collection, so it meant that all the numbers we were working off were artificially high. There was also a separate conversation.
Forgive me, just so that we don't lose track of where we're going.
Yeah, but I think it's a relevant consideration.
Just, if you just bear with me.
Of course.
In the same email, in the middle of the page, there's a bullet point which refers to that very issue. The NHS have looked into the serious concerns raised by the modellers about the hospital admissions data and claim it's causing no more than a 5% error in that data stream. So there was a debate about the significance of the error and what its impact was, but the NHS appeared to say there was no more than a 5% error. But be that as it may, whatever the position was on the data, the CMO and the GCSA were raising a general alarm at the end of June about the risk that the transmission prevalence would go up and that the package which had already been agreed was itself already at the riskier end of the spectrum. So the question for you is, to what extent did HMT understand at the end of June that whatever it proposed to do thereafter came with significant risk?
That's just not my recollection of it. I mean, my recollection was that we went over a set of things that could be done. It was conditional. It was delayed at one stage on the advice from the scientists. So I think that shows that the process was working. I think there were genuine issues about the robustness of the data, but also where the R was coming from, because there was this issue about nosocomial transmission that was definitely not properly understood at the time, potentially accounting for up to a quarter of the transmission, which obviously requires a very different response. But also, I think analysis has been done subsequent to this that I wasn't aware of at the time from, I think, professors of medicine and economics at Imperial and Manchester that applied a Quayle analysis to the first lockdown and its duration. And their Quayle analysis, which you'll be familiar with as a tool of health, public health analysis, suggested that the lockdown in its severity and duration is likely to have generated costs that are greater than the likely benefit. Well, so I think I wasn't aware of that at the time.
I'm so
but
sorry. I don't want to get into quality life assurance models. Is it your position as the Chancellor that at the end of June you are unaware that the government's chief advisors, epidemiological public health advisors, were making clear that the existing package was already at the riskier end of the spectrum, and therefore that going forward, real care would have to be taken to ensure that that prevalence and the R rate going above 1 did not eventuate?
I was always clear that schools was something they viewed as a big risk factor, which I think is alluded to in that email.
Did you know that the package in place was at the riskier end of the spectrum epidemiologically?
I don't precisely remember that, but I do remember it was modelled and designed to keep R at or below 1.
All right.
And as I said, I'm sure it was closer to 1 than it was to 0.1. But remember, as we've discussed in the first session, policymakers are taking into account a whole range of considerations, and the objective strategy here was not to completely suppress the virus. It was to make sure that the NHS was not overwhelmed. That is consistent with a range of R ratios.
The point is well made. Ultimately, the Prime Minister has to make the final decision, and he'll take into account the risk, he'll take into account the economic and fiscal consequences. But the point here is that this demonstrates that the Treasury, because this is your principal private secretary, were told, rightly and responsibly, that there were alarm bells ringing about the package already in place. And therefore, the Treasury could not have been unaware that whatever it proposed in the public interest economically going forward came with risks. I mean, there is no way which any responsible Treasury could consider implementing plans without having at least half an eye on the epidemiological consequences. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been writing to you in this term.
I said I didn't write this email.
And you didn't see it?
I ever saw these emails. That's just not something that I would have done, right? I would have been briefed here and there on things that I needed to know, but I definitely didn't see these emails on a regular basis.
Questions like risk and whether or not Treasury plans would have an impact upon prevalence and an increase in transmission and ultimately hospitalisation and death were obviously issues which were brought to your attention.
Yes, and my strong recollection is that the set of measures that were announced in the May plan was one which the scientists had fedded on, had modelled, and was consistent with R being at or below 1. And on their advice, one step of that plan was delayed for, I think, a fortnight in June. And there were measures that were continued with after this email, which rather suggests that there wasn't a significant concern raised, because when they had raised a concern previous to this, the government acted on it with regard to delaying whichever step it was, step 2 or step 3. So I think there is a track record of the government responding to the concerns that the scientists had and actively delaying a stage of the unlocking.
All right.
So that's all I can remember about that event.
One codicil to this, please, Mr. Sunak. Mr. Hancock told this inquiry that he'd received feedback that the scheme was, quote, causing problems in our intervention areas. And he said that he'd told HMT about those concerns. And that must have been because from the time that he said it at the end of August, in the context of the debate about whether or not there should be an extension. Are you aware that the Secretary of State for Health, who, by your own word, didn't know in advance of the Cabinet meeting, the 8th of July, of the promulgation of the scheme, expressed concerns latterly to your department about the risk of transmission?
No, I'm not sure I have any record of that, but I do know he has said that there has been undue focus on this one item and is evidence to the inquiry.
Excuse me? You're suggesting that he said this isn't a matter of some importance?
I think he said himself that there's been undue focus on this one item, was his words to the inquiry, and I have no recollection of him raising that, nor do I have any record of him doing so with me at the time.